Hey guys, welcome to Bitcoin Math. My name is Shane. In this video, we are going to go over the Living a Bitcoin Standard model and strategy and actually look at my results based on my income that I have converted into Bitcoin using this methodology and the results that has produced so far going back to the beginning of this year. So if you're not familiar, this whole idea centers around the value and appreciation of Bitcoin as a monetary asset compared to the depreciating value of dollars, and how borrowing those dollars, even at a double-digit percentage interest rate, should still produce a meaningful result for you, assuming Bitcoin continues to grow as it has. So if you're not familiar with this concept, I would encourage you to play with this model first. This looks at your net monthly income. I've keyed in mine here. Relative borrowing cost to borrow the dollars. How much money you make in salary increases per year, and the annual inflation rate. I've set the compound annual growth rate at 20%. And what you'll see here is that over time, that purple line gets larger and larger because, well, the Bitcoin you started stacking in year 1, year 2, year 3 is now all of a sudden benefiting from that same 20% CAGR against a much larger base of Bitcoin asset value. And so that's what we're going to look at here. Is I've been doing this now for a year, and based on this model, I'm not too far off of how much I've accumulated. By the end of the year, I'll probably have accumulated about this amount of Bitcoin, so the model does hold up. The other thing that we'll take a look at is the getting started model, right? So if you believe in this concept, but you're not sure how to get started or what LTV you should be targeting, what kind of Bitcoin collateral assets you should bring into this scenario as a buffer, this model will help you. I've keyed in the same metrics here. I've just included my monthly living costs and then my Bitcoin holdings that I was able to bring to this scenario to act as that collateral buffer. So you can see here that using 1 Bitcoin as my collateral buffer shows up right here. I have roughly 17 months worth of my expenses covered with my existing collateral. And that gives me latitude to go ahead and convert all of my monthly income, $7,700 after taxes, retirement costs, things of that nature, into Bitcoin so that I can borrow my living costs against my Bitcoin. And using this model, you can see, well, my LTV is never going to get higher than 49%, assuming Bitcoin continues to grow at 20% growth compounding annually, right? Obviously that will fluctuate. Some years will be higher, others will be lower. That's the whole point of having a buffer, so that you have room to manage that risk and respond in the event of volatility. But directionally speaking, if we were to compare this to just buying Bitcoin with my remaining cash flow, well, I've only got an extra $1,200 a month after all my bills are paid, and I'm only allocating half of that to Bitcoin, so that's $600 a month. Well, you can see here in my cash flow only model, right, I'm only going to accumulate another 0.35 Bitcoin by buying $600 per month. Whereas if I deposit my existing 1 Bitcoin as my starting collateral, I convert all of my income to new Bitcoin, and then I borrow my expenses to live my life, even while paying interest, I'm able to afford this, I'm able to do this, and keep my LTV at a relatively low risk level. And I'm going to add another 4.36 total Bitcoin, right? That's exponentially more than 0.36, right? And so if all of this were to play out the way I've got it modeled here, well, after repaying the loan, even at 20% growth compounding annually, I'd have over $2.4 million in this model, and I'd only have about $945,000 in this model. But remember, both of these also started with 1 Bitcoin, right? So a lot of this value is actually tied up in my starting Bitcoin value, not this additional 0.36 that I added by investing 50% of my remaining cash flow. And so there's really a couple ways to do this as well. You don't have to necessarily use one or the other. One isn't better or worse than the other. They just represent the two different models that exist, or at least that I use. Right? One is using a CeFi lender like Salt Lending. That's where I work. That's where I think the best tools, rates, features, terms, people, experience exist. But there's others out there as well. Arch Lending, Strike, Ledin, Unchained. There's, others like Debify, Lava, HODL HODL. But anyway, there's a lot of resources out there that allow you to do this. And then there's also DeFi, right? So if you want to set up a MetaMask or a Phantom or a Coinbase wallet, you can do that. And then you can interact with the liquidity protocols out there like Aave or Compound. And you can post your collateral and borrow against it. And then all of the transactions, all of the logic, all of the interest, all of the custody, everything is handled typically through the Ethereum smart contract platform, as opposed to having actual counterparties like the lender, like their custodian, like their capital provider, etc. So let's dive into the numbers here. Okay, let me move this. So this is my year-to-date performance in using this model. So my first paycheck was January 14th, 2025. That was my after-tax and withholdings direct deposit. I converted it immediately into Bitcoin. This was the Bitcoin price. That allowed me to buy 0.04 Bitcoin, which is now worth roughly $4,495. Okay. So this Bitcoin value is looking at the current spot price, right? So this times this equals the Bitcoin value. And so I've also included in here, well, what does the year-to-date gain look like on that particular purchase? And then I've summarized all of that here at the bottom. So you can see that as the price of Bitcoin has fluctuated, right? We started off at close to 100, we dropped to 79, 81, 85, 94, right? So I was able to buy the dip there. But then I also bought the top here in these places too, right? And so I'm actually down money in those scenarios. But when you add it all together over the course of the prior almost 10 months now, it's allowed me to accumulate 0.725 Bitcoin, right? And give myself ultimately a 15% raise if I'm looking at the value of that Bitcoin compared to what I was actually paid. Okay. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And I think what people are missing about this whole strategy and the whole benefit behind this strategy. Let's say Bitcoin goes to 250K. Who cares when it is? Let's just say that it gets there. Well, then what will this year's Bitcoin accumulation look like in terms of what I paid for the Bitcoin and what that got me? Well, this represents that. We've changed the input price of Bitcoin to 250K. I bought the exact same amount, but now it's worth a whole lot different amount of money, right? And so my year-to-date gain in 2025 is going to change as the value of Bitcoin goes up over time and I continue to not sell. So when Bitcoin hits 250K, assuming this was the end of the year, well, my $71,000 in income allowed me to acquire what is then worth $181,000 in Bitcoin, right? And that'll be close to $110,000 gain over what I was actually paid, representing more like 150% increase in my salary this year. Let's do it again. How about 500K Bitcoin? Same thing applies, right? My Bitcoin that I bought with each paycheck is the exact same, but the value of that Bitcoin is now worth a whole lot more. My gain that year, 2025, is now $291,000, or roughly a 4x what I was actually paid. Okay. So you could easily expand this methodology to $1 million Bitcoin, $13 million Bitcoin, right? And go full Michael Saylor. But hopefully this gives you a better understanding of why this strategy, why this methodology, why these tools, and why this process are worth considering. Is this the only way? Is this the best way? No. Am I saying you should absolutely do this? Is this financial advice? Of course not. But it's easy to do the math, right? And if you believe in Bitcoin and where it's headed, well, then when you do the math, it's going to produce these kinds of results. And that's why I've been doing this, because I do believe in Bitcoin, and I do think we're going to hit 250. I do think we'll eventually hit 500. And as such, I want to be stacking as much Bitcoin as I can. And the best way for me to do that is to convert my income, all of it, to Bitcoin, never sell it, and borrow against it to live my life. Appreciate the support. If you have any questions or anything like that, there's lots of different ways you can get in touch with us through the website. Feel free to reach out. Let us know how we can make this information or the tools better, or just share your general thoughts with us. As always, we appreciate your support, and we'll see you on the next one.